Hey guys, today we're going to learn all about the CSS Cascade, and you're going to understand why it's actually called a cascading style sheet after completing this lesson. So what exactly is the meaning of the cascading part of the cascading style sheet? Well, it's really only relevant when we think about multiple different conflicting CSS rules. So if you have different rules that target the same element, for example, in H1, then we have to determine which one is higher up in the hierarchy. And this method of working out which of the rules actually get applied and which ones get ignored is how our cascade comes to be. Imagine if you have a cascade where there is a pool at the top and then there is another one at the bottom. If we think about how the rule gets applied, then the browser is going to look at the water level. Imagine if this rule gets applied first, and then as the water falls down the cascade, it sees another rule that's applying to the same element. Then you will see this style, number 1, being applied. So multiple styles can be applied to the same thing, but because of the order of importance, the one that is the most important once you've finished the cascade is the one the user actually sees on screen. Here's an example. Let's say we've got a ordered list which has 3 list items. And then in our styles.css, we set all of the list items to have a green color. Now, once you run the code at this point, everything is going to turn green. And now we have a list of 3 ordered list items, all with green text. Now, however, if one of those list items happen to have an inline style where we've got the style attribute being set and we set it to a different color, in this case red, what do you think will happen when we run this updated code? Well, that is where our cascade comes in. The first level of applying style comes from the external style sheet, and then it's going to look to see, well, maybe there are internal styles being applied via the style tag. And if there aren't any, then it's going to look at the next level and see that, oh, are there any inline styles being applied? And this is the final style that gets applied to this particular list item. And so, in the end, we end up with everything being green, but then in the last minute, this one gets changed to red because of the way the cascade works. There are 4 broad categories which we look at when we're determining the overall level of importance of a CSS rule. And these categories are position, specificity, type, and importance. And I'm going to go through each of these with a code example. The first thing we look at the very top of the cascade is whether if a rule is at a higher or lower position in the CSS relative to other rules. Notice here I've got 2 rules applying to the same thing and setting the same property. I'm trying to set the color of the text red, but I'm also trying to set it blue. Well, in fact, they both happen, but the one that is lower down simply replaces the previous one. So first it becomes red and then immediately becomes blue. So this is what you're going to see on screen. The position of a CSS rule can apply to the position within the curly braces of a selector, but it could also be that you target the same element lower down in this. So I could target the li again down here, and I could set the color to green. And in this case, because this is even lower down than these 2 positions, so this is 1, 2, and 3, then this one is going to be the final one that we'll see. The lower down in a CSS external file or in an internal style element, the more important it is. If we're looking at this cascade, a rule that gets applied here will then be replaced by a rule that gets applied here and finally here. So the lower down the file the rule is, the more important it is. Now, the next category is the specificity. And CSS specificity refers to how specific a selector is in terms of the elements that you're applying the CSS rule to. As an example, let's say we create a list item element and we give it an ID that's equal to first ID, and then we give it a class that's equal to first class. And then finally, we give it the attribute of draggable as well. And this is our opening tag for our list item element. Now, if we look at this element and we think about the different ways that we can target this element, then these 4 CSS rules will all target this particular element, but they have different specificity. And they're listed in order. The first one selects all the list item elements. So there could be many other list item elements in our HTML file. So this is the least specific. It's the element selector. The next level of specificity is the class selector. Remember, the class selector starts with a dot, and this will select all the other list elements that have this class name, first class. And because we can have multiple different elements with the same class, for this reason, it is more specific than element, but it's also not the most specific way of selecting an element. The next one is selecting on attribute. Even though most sources will tell you that attribute and class are actually the same level of specificity, if you try it out, in most cases, the attribute will override the class. In this case, we're selecting on this attribute of draggable, and we're turning the list item that has that attribute set to the color of purple. And at this point of our code, if we didn't go any further, our text would look purple. So the final level of specificity and the most specific is the ID selector, which is denoted by the pound sign or the hashtag sign. And this is the most specific because theoretically on a single web page, you should only have one particular ID name. So it essentially targets only one element on the page. So the order of specificity is ID, attribute, class, and element. If we think about our cascade, starting up here, firstly, we look to see if there are any element selectors that target a particular element. Then we look at class, then we look at attribute, and finally we look at ID. And if we applied the CSS rules in this order, then the final one will be the one that will be applied. So if all of these rules were applied to this particular element, then finally what we would see is the text would be orange. Now the next category is the type. We know that there are 3 different ways that we can apply CSS to a particular file. We can use the external style sheet, which is done using the link element, linking to a particular file in our project folder. Then there is internal CSS, which is done through the style element and putting the CSS in between the open and closing brackets of the style element. And finally, there is the inline style, where the CSS is applied through the style attribute inside the opening tag of an actual HTML element. In terms of the cascade, the most important are the styles that are applied inline, because this targets only one specific element. It's just this H1. It doesn't matter if you have 10 other H1s, this style is only going to be applied to this particular element. The next one is the internal, because the internal style sheet only exists inside one web page, whereas the external style sheet can actually be applied across many different HTML files as long as you all link to the same CSS file. In this order of our cascade, first we check if there are any styles relevant from the external style sheet, then we check whether if there are any from the internal style sheet, and finally if there are any inline styles. So then going down the cascade, this is the order where the CSS will get applied. If you had the same thing, so targeting the H1, setting its color here, here, and here, if they all target the same element and they're all trying to change the same property, say the text color, then this is going to be the one that will be shown on screen after you cascade through the different levels. The final thing, which is a keyword that you can apply to any CSS rule, is the important keyword. So you could have a color property set, and we know how we set it normally by simply adding a value after the property. But if you add a space and then you add this keyword, exclamation mark, and then the important word, then this is going to ensure that this is going to be the most important rule relative to that element. It doesn't matter how important this previous rule is. It could have been inline, or it could have been in an ID selector, or it could have been at the very bottom of the page. This rule is going to come out as the top trump. If you haven't already, I recommend taking notes of this page because you can actually use this as a very handy way of working out why your CSS is not working, or when you're trying to do something specific and you're trying to make sure that a CSS rule gets applied. You can work your way from the top of the cascade all the way down. And there is obviously the higher level, which is the categories, position, specificity, type, and importance. And then within each cascade, you can imagine there's almost a mini cascade level where you determine which one is most important. Now we're going to try out some quizzes to enforce these rules. And I recommend taking a photo of this page and having it side by side while you do the quiz. Because remember, we're programmers. We're not here to memorize things. You can always look at this page when needed. This is the first quiz. Here we have an H1 element, and it's got a class as well as an ID. And there are two different CSS rules. And you can assume that they are both on an external style sheet. So our style.css. Now I want you to pick what will be the final color of this H1. Will it be blue or will it be green? And once you've made your selection, go ahead and use your QR code reader to scan the QR code that corresponds to your answer, blue or green, and then you will see a GIF to tell you whether if you got it right or wrong. So you have 30 seconds starting now. All right, so did you get it right? So in this case, we have a specificity battle because this is a class selector and this is an ID selector. When we're looking at the specificity, the most specific always wins. So in this case, the ID will trump the class. And that's why if this code was run, which you can test out yourself, the color of the text will be green. So this was the correct answer. Did you get that right? If not, don't worry, we've got more questions coming up. This is our next quiz question. Again, we've got an H1 element, but notice this time it's got two classes applied, a class and another class. You can apply multiple classes to the same element as long as you add a space in between them. Now your job is to determine what is the final color of this H1. Is it going to be blue or is it going to be green? You have 30 seconds starting now. In this case, what's relevant is the position of our CSS rule. Because notice that they both have the same specificity. This is a class selector and this is also a class selector, and they both select the same element right here. And we're assuming that they're in the same file, so no difference in terms of external, internal, or inline. So then the only thing that matters is the order where they appear in the file. So remember that the cascade goes from the top to the bottom, and the ones at the bottom will be the ones that replace the ones at the top. So in this case, the final color of the H1 will be blue. When all other things are equal, for example, specificity, type, and importance, then we look at a specific category and see which one comes out trumps. Here's the final quiz question for today. Here we have an HTML file, and I want you to figure out what will be the final color of the H1. Will it be blue or will it be green? You have 30 seconds. Clock starts now. All right, so in this case, what we've got is an ID called an ID, and we have an inline style being applied. So remember, in terms of specificity, ID selectors are the most important. However, the CSS specificity as a category is not as important as the type of CSS being applied. This is going to be higher in terms of importance than this. Our final color for our H1 will in fact be blue. Remember that the cascade goes from here to here to here to here. Even if something that has won out on specificity, it can also lose because of the type. So you have to keep in mind the order of importance of the big categories, but also the order of importance of the small categories. So now it's time to try an exercise and write the code yourself so that we really solidify this knowledge in our minds and really get to grips with it. Go ahead and download the zipped starting code for the exercise from this lesson. Once you've extracted and opened it up inside VS Code, I want you to go inside the index.html and look at the starting code that we've created here. The goal is to not change any of the HTML, but actually write your code inside the style.css. And what we're trying to achieve is to turn this into this. And notice I've given you some little bits of hint. For example, the fact that every box has 10 pixels of padding on all four sides. And also notice that in the CSS code, there's already some existing code that basically just gets rid of some of the defaults and sets you up for the rest of the challenge. So don't change any of the existing code, either the CSS or the HTML. Look at the goal image, see what it's got, and you're going to need to write some code to change a number of things. So the first thing is these pieces of text should be white, as you can see here. It might be a little bit too difficult in terms of the contrast, but these should be white. And then notice how this text is actually inside a div that should be red. And similarly down here. The final thing is that there should be a div that encloses everything, and it should be colored purple. And notice that there is 10 pixels of padding here, there is 10 pixels of padding here, and there's 10 pixels of padding here. There's a number of things that you have to do using CSS and using what you've learned about the CSS Cascade in order to achieve this. And the reason why the Cascade is really important is because you can't add any additional classes, you can't change any of the HTML. So you're going to have to use everything that you've got access to in order to achieve this outcome. This is a tricky challenge, and I want you to spend some time thinking about it and thinking about what you've learned and referring back to maybe the previous parts of the video and revising what you've learned in this lesson. Pause the video now and complete this challenge. All right, I'm going to go through the solution so that you can check your work and make sure that you understand everything that's going on. So I'm going to pull up the goal image, so have it side by side with the current preview of the index.html. That way I can compare to see I've reached the goal or not. Now, the first thing I need to do is change this text to white, which is the easiest, because notice that these are in a particular class, whereas these don't have any class applied. So the class is white text, so I can go ahead and do that right here, use a class selector, choose the class I want, white text, and then go ahead and set the color of the text to white. There we go. So that's first part. So I'm getting closer to the final outcome. Now, the next thing I need to do is to make this box red. So this box is the box that encloses the white text, so it's this particular div. And notice that it's got two classes applied to it, box and inner box. So this inner box isn't actually present as a class on any of the rest of the divs, so I can select that quite easily. Up here next to my other box, I'm going to select the inner-box class, and I'm going to set the background color to red. Now, if we look inside our preview, you can see we're getting pretty close. Now, the next difference is this final outside box, which I want to be purple. This is the div that encloses everything, which is this one that has an ID of outer box. This is really the only thing that differentiates this div from any of the other divs, because they all share the class of box. This red div has the class of box, this blue div has the class of box, and this outer div also has that same class, which is why we're able to apply the 10 pixels of padding to all three simply using the original code of box. If I want to target this outer box, then I have to use the thing that's unique to it, which is the ID. So now I'm going to select the ID called outer box, and I'm going to set its background color to purple. And now you can see I have achieved the final goal outcome. The important thing here to realize is, firstly, we don't need to add any padding to the inner box or the outer box, because all three of those divs share a class called box, and that 10 pixels of padding is already applied there. Notice if I go ahead and go in here and set the padding, it doesn't change anything because it's already got 10 pixels of padding. But because the ID selector is more specific, if I say change the padding to 50 pixels, then it would actually be the one that will come out trumps. The second thing that I wanted you to realize is that the ID selector is more specific than the class selector. So even though for all three divs I've set the background color to blue, because this selects an ID, this will override it. Now, the other thing you have to realize is in order to set the inner box background color to red, this rule actually has to be below this rule, because watch as I move it up. Now, in this case, we don't have a red box anymore because these two have the same specificity. They're both selecting a class. Here we're setting it to red, but later on we set all the divs with a box class to blue. So this refers to the position of our CSS rule. Hopefully this will give you some practical experience with the CSS Cascade and reinforce some of the lessons that we learned earlier. In the next lesson, we're going to learn how to combine different selectors so that we narrow down on a particular element that we want to select on screen, rather than simply broad stroke setting the CSS of everything. For all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.